On November 18, 1521, the Armada de Molucca entered the harbor of Tidor. Firing a joyful salute, they dropped anchor in 20 fathoms and fired another round of artillery, the report of the guns echoing off the island's tranquil hills. In the humid climate, the strong sense of clove and cinnamon wafted across the water, reviving the weary crew members with the promise of riches. The following day, an emissary from Tidor floated out to the ships in a luxurious proa, his head protected from the sun by a silk awning. His son, bearing a ceremonial scepter, was at his side. They were accompanied by a pair of ritual hand-washers, bearing sweet water in jars made of gold, and 2 other bearers carrying a gold casket filled with an offering of betel nuts. The emissary introduced himself as Al-Mansur, a Muslim name, but the officers came to know him by the Spanish version, Almanzor. He appeared to be in his 40s and rather rotund. Almanzor's theatrical arrival was calculated to announce that he was an important personage, the king of Tidor, and an enthusiastic astrologer. As intended, the officers recognized that gaining Almanzor's goodwill would be vital, because he was the gatekeeper to the cloves, which they had come so far to find. But Almanzor's little kingdom was in constant peril, and he needed these visitors from afar as much as they needed him or his spices. From his resplendent proa, Almanzor enthusiastically welcomed the fleet. According to Pigafetta, he declared, "After such long tossing upon the seas and so many dangers, come and enjoy the pleasures of the land, and refresh your bodies, and do not think but that you have arrived at the kingdom of your own sovereign." But then Almanzor startled them all by announcing that he had dreamed of their arrival, and they had fulfilled his prophecy. Almanzor boarded Trinidad under the watchful eyes of the officers, who offered him the velvet-covered chair of honor. Almanzor lowered himself into it, but conveyed the impression that he was accommodating them by consenting to sit, after which he received us as children, in Pigafetta's astonished words. For all his graciousness, Almanzor had a stubborn streak. He refused to bow or even to tilt his head, even when it was necessary. When he was invited to enter Trinidad's cabin, he refused to stoop, as her crew members routinely did. Instead, he mounted the upper deck and descended from above, his head rigidly erect. In conversation, Almanzor revealed that he was familiar with Spain, and even with its great and powerful ruler, King Charles. Almanzor insisted that he and the people of Tidor fervently desired to serve the king and his kingdom, an assertion that immediately made the officers suspect that Almanzor had another agenda that involved switching his allegiance from the Portuguese to the Spanish. The officers were correct. A decade earlier, the father of the island's current ruler had encouraged the Portuguese to set up a trading station, in part because he wished to loosen the Arab stranglehold on the island's crops. Local politics also influenced Almanzor's thinking. At the time, Tidor was embroiled in a conflict with its island neighbor, Ternate, still in the Portuguese grip, and Almanzor thought these representatives of the Spanish crown could make powerful allies in the struggle. The officers quickly made trading pacts with Almanzor and bestowed so many gifts that he asked them to restrain their overwhelming generosity. On November 10th, Carvalho and a small detachment went ashore, and for the first time, the men of the Armada de Molucca set foot on the Spice Islands. The Armada's men had seen cloves, smelled cloves, and tasted cloves, but only now did they find cloves growing in the wild, not just a few trees scattered here and there, but a dense, impenetrable forest of cloves. On their first visit to Tidor, the Armada's leaders reached an agreement with Almanzor, recognizing Spain's sovereignty over the island, even though it violated the Treaty of Tordesillas. Once these formalities were over, the leaders wanted to obtain the spices as quickly as they could, before local strife drove them away. The men had seen too many warm receptions turn violent for them to believe that Almanzor would keep his word for very long. The king of Tidor advised the Armada's officers that he did not have enough cloves on hand to satisfy their needs, but he offered to accompany them to Buchan, where he assured them that they would find as much as they wanted. On Monday, November 11th, the rulers of Ternate began their diplomatic offensive. One of the king's many sons came out to the fleet in a proa. The sight of the approaching craft caused Espinosa to panic, for he had cast his lot with Ternate's enemy, Tidor. What was he to do? Almanzor, who remained near at hand, calmly advised Espinosa to act as he saw fit. Espinosa and the other officers aboard Trinidad stiffly welcomed the visitors, bestowed gifts on them, and watched closely for signs of trouble. They found that while considerable enmity still existed between the kings of Tidor and Ternate, the rulers of Ternate were also in favor of Spain, and he assured the officers that they were as welcome on Ternate as they were on Tidor. Trading for spices got underway with astonishing speed. The king of Tidor gave orders to prepare a trading house, probably recovered from the days of the Portuguese occupation, to accommodate the new arrivals. 4 days after they had dropped anchor in Tidor Harbor, the Armada de Molucca was in business. The men of the fleet valued their take according to the quintelada they received. A quintelada was a percentage of the storage space set aside for the crew members and officers. Following the instructions King Charles gave to Magellan on May 8, 1519, each significant crew member of the Armada received a specific number of quinteladas. Once they paid 1/24th of the amount to the king, they could keep the rest for themselves. Over the next several days, trading continued at a feverish pace. They received a haul that a sailor might expect to see once or twice in a lifetime. As trading proceeded, Almanzor did all he could to put the Armada at ease, even when the officers revealed that they were holding 16 captives taken from the islands they had visited. To the officers' surprise, the confession delighted the king, and he asked to take possession of the captives, in Pigafetta's words, so that he might send them back to their land with 5 of his own men, that they might make the king of Spain and his fame known. There was also the ticklish matter of Carvalho's harem of 3 captive women, whom the officers delivered to Almanzor for his personal use. On the afternoon of November 13th, Pedro Alfonso de la Rosa, a Portuguese governor living in the islands, hailed the fleet from a proa. He excitedly explained that the king of Ternate had given permission for the visit and instructed him to answer all questions truthfully. There followed one of the more remarkable reunions in the Age of Discovery. In a time when travelers separated from their native cultures were often never heard from again, here was a Portuguese explorer standing before the Armada's officers after a 10-year silence, in good humor and eager to impart vital intelligence concerning the Armada de Molucca. From Pedro Alfonso de la Rosa's recollections, the officers learned that the implacable Portuguese authorities had been pursuing the Armada around the globe. The Portuguese pursuit of the Armada did not end there. Pigafetta recorded, a few days earlier, a caravel with 2 junks had been there to learn news of us, but the junks went to Buchan to load cloves with 7 Portuguese, and because they did not respect the king's wives and subjects, although the king had often told them not to behave thus, and since they refused to abstain and withdraw, they were put to death. Pigafetta continued, and when the men of the caravel learned this, they immediately returned to Malacca, leaving the junks with 400 bahars of cloves and as much merchandise as would purchase another 100 bahars. Moreover, he told us that every year many junks come from Malacca to Bandan to take and load mace and nutmeg, and from Bandan to Malacca to get cloves, and that these people go with their junks from Malacca to Bandan in 3 days, and from Bandan to Malacca in 15, and that the King of Portugal had already secretly enjoyed Malacca for 10 years, that the King of Spain should not know. This last piece of information explained why King Manuel had refused Magellan over and over again. A water route such as Magellan proposed, no matter how daring, threatened to disturb Portugal's lucrative but clandestine trade in spices. Spain, with no such secret relationship, would naturally benefit from Magellan's plan. How strange and wrong-headed to imagine, as did the mutineers and those whom they influenced in Spain, that Magellan attempted to subvert the fleet to aid Portugal. After fleeing Portugal, Magellan had been as loyal to Spain as he had claimed to be. The officers of the Armada plied Pedro Alfonso de la Rosa with alcohol, so the revelations came thick and fast. Not until 3 o'clock in the morning did the exhausted wanderer reach the end of his tale. Amazed and persuaded by his stories, the officers begged him to join their number, as Pigafetta said, by promising him good wages and salaries. A man without a country, he agreed. After eluding the agents of the Portuguese crown for so long, he would live to regret this decision. Pigafetta recorded, "On Friday the 15th of November, the king told us that he was going to Magellan to fetch the said cloves that the Portuguese had left there, and he requested of us 2 presents to give to the 2 governors of Mutir in the name of the king of Spain." Now that the Europeans finally had their hands on the spices, Almanzor chose this moment to involve them in local politics, explaining that he wanted his visitors to return to the islands as soon as possible with even more ships. Even though the officers had experienced the bitter lessons of becoming ensnared in local vendettas, they blithely assured Almanzor they would help him. Content with this vague promise of assistance, the king invited everyone ashore for a banquet to celebrate the occasion. The innocent gesture immediately sent the men of the Armada into a panic, because it reminded them of the massacre at the banquet on Cebu. Suddenly the officers of the Armada saw signs of impending doom wherever they looked. Even the recently cleaned streets of the village, visible from the boats, appeared ominous. But they could not spurn the king's invitation, because they depended on his goodwill for access to the spices. Rather than go ashore, the officers offered to invite the king onto their ships, where they would bestow gifts on him, and even leave behind 4 men who wished to remain in the Spice Islands. Accepting the counteroffer, Almanzor immediately boarded Trinidad, in Pigafetta's words, boasting that he entered there as safely as into his own houses. As the suspicious sailors listened, he said that he was greatly amazed to hear that the Armada was about to weigh anchor and sail away. He meant no harm, or so he said, and only wanted to help them obtain their spices and journey home safely. Pigafetta said, "He besought us that we should not leave at once, seeing that it was not yet the season for navigation among those islands, and also because of the rocks and reefs that were around the island of Bandan, and also because we might easily have encountered the Portuguese." These were all persuasive arguments, as the officers realized themselves, and he demonstrated his sincerity by saying that if the Armada wanted to leave now, he would do nothing to stop it. He requested only that they take back all the gifts they had conferred on him, because the kings, his neighbors, would say that the king of Tidor had received so many gifts from so great a king, that is, King Charles, and had given him nothing, and they would think that we had departed only for fear of some deception and treachery, whereby he would always be named and reputed a traitor. Here at last was the underlying reason why Almanzor wanted the Armada to stay, to save face in front of the neighboring rulers. If he could maintain an alliance with his powerful visitors, he would impress and intimidate the jealous rulers of the other islands. But if he lost the visitors' favor, if they dismissed him as insignificant, he would appear vulnerable to the other kings. The officers began to appreciate what Magellan had always refused to acknowledge in his dealings with the islanders. Their presence placed both sides in peril. The king became even more emotional as he sought to appeal to their hearts as well as their minds. Pigafetta noted, "He had his crown brought, And, first kissing it and setting it on his head 4 or 5 times, he said in the presence of all that he swore by Allah, his great God, and by his crown which he had in his hand, that he desired to be forever a very loyal friend of the King of Spain. And he spoke these words almost weeping. The king's tears softened the officers' hearts, and they decided to stay another 15 days. To strengthen their shared bond of loyalty to the King of Spain, the officers gave the grateful Almanzor a royal banner displaying the insignia associated with Charles. The king was apparently sincere in his goodwill toward the crew, but what about the other islanders? A few days later, the crew members heard that the lesser chiefs had urged Almanzor to kill all the Europeans because, so Pigafetta said, it would give great pleasure to the Portuguese. The king sternly replied that he would not harm the visitors under any circumstances. Working feverishly throughout the last days of November and the early days of December, the men of the Armada de Molucca purchased and stored cloves until they had no more trinkets, caps, bells, mirrors, hatchets, scissors, or bolts of cloth to exchange for spices, and no more room to store the aromatic treasure. The ships reeked of the fragrant cloves. Every breath the sailors drew was permeated with the sense of wealth, ease, and luxury. Crew members busied themselves in bending and decorating the sails for the ships, restoring the rigging and making sure the vessels would be able to withstand the rigors of the journey home. When hoisted, the sheets revealed a freshly painted design, an elaborate cross, and beneath it the legend, "This is the sign of our good fortune." As that bold legend indicated, the officers and crew of the Armada were proud of their accomplishments. Their voyage finally demonstrated what Columbus and so many other explorers had failed to show, that a water route to the Moluccas existed, and that it was possible to reach the east by sailing west. Those who had survived the grueling journey could look back on countless moments of courage and even heroism that helped to bring them to this place, and they could console themselves with dreams of glory and avarice. As the hour of departure approached, the pace of activity quickened. The fleet took on board 80 casks of water and a supply of wood cut by 100 laborers assigned to the task by the King of Bacan, who rallied to the cause of the Armada and Spain. On the day of departure, the kings of all the Spice Islands assembled on the island of Mar to see the fleet off. Victoria weighed anchor and set sail, standing off the harbor awaiting Trinidad, the flagship, to join her. The ship's gunners fired their artillery one more time. But in the midst of the excitement, Trinidad's cables fouled, and to the dismay of everyone, she began taking on water. None of the eyewitnesses supplied a reason for the near disaster. Most likely the ship had not been adequately repaired during the long layover on Simbamban. But the leak was worse than ever, and she was in danger of losing her cargo of spices. With her sister ship in distress, said Pigafetta, Victoria returned to her anchorage, and we immediately began to lighten Trinidad to see whether we could repair her. We found that the water was rushing in as through a pipe, but we were unable to find where it was coming in. All that day and the next, we did nothing but work the pump. The work was grueling but necessary. The loss of Trinidad would have been a disaster, depriving the Armada of the rewards of its long sought-after spices. Even worse, Victoria lacked room to hold the crews of both vessels. The arduous pumping continued until the men were exhausted. Laden with spices, the flagship of the fleet was on the verge of sinking at her mooring. As soon as Almanzor heard about the plight of Trinidad, he sprang into action, boarding the afflicted ship and prowling below deck, trying to locate the source of the damnable leak, but without success. Then, said Pigafetta, he sent 5 men into the water to see whether they could discover the hole. They remained more than 1/2 hour, but were quite unable to find the leak. The ship was listing badly, and desperate measures were required, as Pigafetta described. Seeing that he could not help us, and the water was increasing hourly, he said, almost in tears, that he would send to the head of the island for 3 men who could remain under water a long time. Almanzor went in search of them as the ship slowly but unmistakably settled into the water. After an anxious night, Almanzor reappeared with the men by first light of dawn. Pigafetta said he immediately sent them into the water with their hair hanging loose so that they could locate the leak by that means. Water entering into the ship would draw strands of their hair into its current. But even these men failed to locate the leak, and when they emerged grim-faced from the water, the king finally broke down in tears. Who among them, he pleaded, would be able to return to Spain now and tell King Charles about the loyalty of the King of Tidor? Pigafetta and the others tried to calm the distraught ruler by describing their new plan for returning to Spain. Said Pigafetta, "We replied to him that Victoria would go there in order not to lose east winds that were beginning to blow, while the other ship, until being refitted, would await west winds and go then to Darien, which is located in the other part of the sea in the country of Yucatan. Her cargo of spices would then be transferred to mules, and the beasts would carry the spices to another Spanish fleet headed for Seville." As devoted and helpful as ever, Almanzor pledged no fewer than 250 carpenters to perform all the work, so Pigafetta said, required to return Trinidad to seaworthiness, and he promised to treat all the sailors who remained behind as if they were his own sons. The king's sincerity and generosity finally wore away the officer's skepticism. The unsuccessful efforts to repair Trinidad's mysterious leak and the deliberations leading to the decision that Victoria would return alone consumed 5 days. Victoria was so dilapidated that many crew members refused to board her. They preferred to remain with Trinidad in Tidor until she was repaired. So the crew divided itself between the two ships, each man seeking the lesser of two evils: Victoria, the flimsy vessel that would depart for Spain immediately, or the much larger Trinidad, which needed weeks, if not months, of repairs before she could begin her journey home. In the end, Carvalho was designated captain of Trinidad, and Elcano took over the command of Victoria. Pigafetta faced the most critical decision of the entire journey. Which ship would he join? His instinct for survival had stood many tests, and he elected to go along with Elcano aboard Victoria. That ship would carry him along with her crew of about 60 men, including 16 Indians. Although he detested the Basque mariner, he clearly had more confidence in Elcano's seamanship than in Carvalho's. Early on the morning of December 21st, Almanzor, ever helpful, came aboard Victoria for the last time, delivering 2 pilots, paid for by the crew, to guide the ship safely through the maze of islands and shoals. Then the king took his leave. This should have been a festive occasion, the ships bulging with spices, heading for home port in the prospect of a grand reception from King Charles. But the damage to Trinidad dramatically altered the final leg of this voyage around the world and mocked the proud legend painted on her sails. The crew faced more than the ordinary pangs of leaving port for another long journey at sea. They knew their lives would be at risk the moment they were out of sight of the Spice Islands. Despite the obstacles they had faced, the men of the Armada had always taken comfort in the knowledge that they had extra ships at their disposal. Even 2 ships had a reasonable chance of making it back to Seville, but 1 ship was hardly equal to the task, no matter how skillful the crew's seamanship or how favorable the winds. 1 ship, alone on the high seas, was always at the mercy of storms, shoals, pirates, termites, or faulty navigation. On the high seas, no king can protect them, and at least one sovereign, the King of Portugal, wanted them dead. Yet they had no choice but to face the test presented by the 10,000-mile-long route home. Laden with cloves and about 60 survivors, Victoria left the island of Tidor on December 21st, 1521. Heading southwest, she called at a small island nearby to load firewood and resumed her southerly course toward one of the most dangerous stretches of ocean in the world, the Cape of Good Hope. The character of the expedition had changed completely. The Armada de Molucca finally had its spices, but it had lost its soul. The absence of Magellan's guiding hand, his fierce discipline, Even his quixotic delusions of grandeur left the two remaining ships and their crew members without a sense of overriding purpose. Only survival mattered now. Even if the crew survived the voyage home, they were anxious about the reception they would receive in Spain. Although they had no knowledge of San Antonio's arrival in Seville 7 months earlier, they suspected that the mutineers aboard that ship might have made it back and succeeded in discrediting Magellan. 2 days after Christmas, the ship found anchorage in Jacquiol Bay, where the crew obtained fresh and much-needed supplies, along with an Indonesian pilot who knew his way around these islands. Under his guidance, the crew sailed on as if in a trance, heading south, narrowly avoiding Moors and cannibals, coral reefs and hidden sandbars. Eventually, Victoria put the Indonesian islands astern, passing through the Alor Strait and eluding pirates. As a lone vessel laden with spices, Victoria was especially vulnerable to predators. On January 8, 1522, Victoria entered the Banda Sea, extending west of the Moluccas, and the torpid weather suddenly changed. "We were struck by a fierce storm," Pigafetta reported, "which caused us to make a pilgrimage to Our Lady of Guidance. Running before the storm, we landed at a lofty island, but before reaching it, we were greatly worn out by the violent gusts of wind that came from the mountains of that island and the great currents of water. The squall nearly shattered the ship, but Elcano avoided the rocks and reefs, and when the seas moderated, Victoria limped to an anchorage close to shore." The next day, divers inspecting the hull discovered extensive damage, and the men gingerly hauled the vessel onto a beach to commence repairs and caulking. 2 weeks later, with repairs to the hull completed, Elcano gave the order to resume their voyage home, and the crew set sail on Saturday, January 25th. Victoria, having sailed 5 leagues or so, called at the island of Timor, towering nearly 10,000 feet above the shimmering surface of the Pacific. Everyone aboard her looked forward to a luxurious, satisfying time ashore, because food and spices, almonds, rice, bananas, ginger, and fragrant wood were all said to grow there in abundance. To guarantee cooperation with the islanders, Elcano ordered a party of sailors ashore in search of a bargaining chip. Said Pigafetta, "Since we had but few things, and hunger was constraining us, we restrained in the ship a chief and his son from another village." With their hostages in hand, the Armada's officers proceeded to negotiate for the food they so desperately needed. The strategy worked exactly as planned, and the recalcitrant islanders delivered a ransom of 6 buffalo, a dozen goats, and as many pigs to the grateful yet rapacious sailors in exchange for the hostages' freedom. In the early hours of Wednesday, February 11th, Victoria weighed anchor and put the island of Timor astern, sailing along a southwesterly course. With Java, and later on Sumatra, barely visible to starboard, she headed for her meeting with destiny at the Cape of Good Hope. The struggle with the elements was joined within days of leaving Timor, as Victoria became the plaything of the unstable weather systems of the southern latitudes. Pigafetta explained, "In order that we might double the Cape of Good Hope, we descended to 42 degrees on the side of the Antarctic Pole. We were 9 weeks near that cape with our sails hauled down because we had the west and northwest winds on our bow quarter and because of a most furious storm." Although the Cape of Good Hope was first rounded in 1488 by Bartholomew Dias and 9 years later by Vasco da Gama, both major accomplishments in Portuguese exploration history, it was still considered extremely hazardous and barely navigable, even by the most seaworthy of ships and the most experienced of captains. It occupied a nearly mythical place in the Portuguese consciousness as the most fearsome passage in the entire world. Sebastián Elcano had never experienced anything like the fierce, confused winds and riptides of Cabo Tormentoso. Doubling it would tax his navigational skills, his patience, and his daring to the utmost. Many of the crew wanted to jump ship at the island of Madagascar rather than risk doubling the Cape. Doing so meant a life of exile and slavery, because Madagascar was a Portuguese stronghold. Over the following days and weeks, the crew, hovering on the verge of starvation and dreading the onset of scurvy, steadily ate their way through their supply of rice and awaited whatever destiny had in store. 1,500 miles to the east, Trinidad prepared to leave the island of Tidor. On April 6th, after more than 3 months of repairs, she finally weighed anchor and unfurled her sails. The ship carried a full load of spices, 1,000 quintals of cloves, 50 tons, more than enough to justify the expense of the entire voyage. Magellan's former flagship was commanded by Gonzalo Gomez de Espinosa, and her pilot was Juan Bautista Ponzarol, known to history as the Genoese pilot, after the name of the short memoir of the voyage he left behind. Sorely missed was Juan Carvalho, the capable pilot who had become a corrupt captain general. He had died of unknown causes on February 14th. As the fleet's alguacil, or master-at-arms, Espinosa had performed as a loyal servant to King Charles, but as a captain, Espinosa was hopelessly out of his element. Espinosa, a soldier, was simply not qualified to command a ship. The challenge of guiding Trinidad halfway around the world, often against the prevailing winds, was beyond him, as it might have been beyond even Magellan had he lived to face it. Espinosa decided to leave behind 4 men to operate a trading post on the island of Tidor. The post would store cloves and serve as a symbol of Spanish rule in the Spice Islands. Setting sail, Espinosa backtracked and followed an easterly course through waters the fleet had already explored, past Gilolo and Morotai, and into the Philippine Sea, all the way to the island of Como, where Trinidad took on more provisions. From this point on, stout easterly headwinds got the better of his navigational skills, and he took a more northerly course. The choice proved disastrous. Although he now understood how large the Pacific Ocean was, his ideas about the location of land masses in the northern hemisphere were deeply flawed. He mistakenly believed that Asia was connected to the American continent, and that misunderstanding led him to assume that if he sailed far enough north, he would catch benign westerly winds. But soon after his departure, the monsoon season started in earnest, bringing with it a seemingly endless succession of storms and drenching rains. A more ill-advised global detour cannot be imagined. One can only wonder what he was thinking as he sailed as far north as Japan, into ever more frigid waters. Even Espinosa admitted that his course placed the ship in peril, first from the weather and then from illness. Finally, Espinosa came to his senses. "When I saw the people suffering," he later said, "the contrary weather, and that I had been at sea for 5 months, I turned back to the Moluccas." After a brief respite at the Islands of the Thieves to collect water, Espinosa commanded Trinidad to resume her retreat toward Tidor. But as he approached his goal, he received shocking news. On May 13th, 5 weeks after Trinidad's departure from Tidor, a fleet of 7 Portuguese ships, all looking for Magellan in the Armada de Molucca, had arrived at the island. Their leader was Antonio de Brito, bearing a royal appointment as governor of the Spice Islands. Espinosa dispatched a boat bearing a letter for Captain Brito, begging for sympathy. He told a pathetic tale. His ship was in bad condition, down to its last anchor. One storm could send her to the bottom, and he was in desperate need of supplies. Had Magellan been alive, he would never have been so foolish as to write a letter to the Portuguese captain charged with capturing him. And the last thing he would have done was to reveal his whereabouts and weaknesses to the enemy. He would have known there was no chance of mercy from the Portuguese. Rather than the compassion Espinosa expected, the letter only made Brito gloat. After searching the Indies for 3 years, the Portuguese governor now knew exactly where the Armada de Molucca was located, and once he had captured the crew, he would treat them as cruelly as he wished. A few days later, a Portuguese caravel with 20 armed men stormed Benacanora, the harbor where Espinosa had sought refuge. The soldiers boarded Trinidad, expecting to overwhelm the crew. but they were repelled by the grievous spectacle of men near death, a foul and unhealthy stench that no one dared to brave, and a ship on the verge of sinking. Everything Espinosa had said in his letter to Brito was true. Trinidad and her crew were in desperate condition and offered no threat to the Portuguese. Unmoved, the Portuguese soldiers arrested Espinosa and sailed Magellan's fetid and decrepit flagship to Ternate. There Brito took possession of Trinidad's papers, logbooks, quadrants, and astrolabes. Included in the haul were the diary of Andres de San Martin and, it is said, Magellan's personal logbook. Brito ordered the ship stripped of all her sails and rigging, and in this condition she rode helplessly at anchor until a severe storm hit the island. The wind smashed apart the remains of the once proud ship, her precious cargo of cloves sank, and the splintered remnants of her hull washed ashore. The flagship of the Armada de Molucca ended up as driftwood. Espinosa had squandered his chance for glory. If he had succeeded in guiding Trinidad home, he would have earned a place in history and a fortune for himself. Instead, his indecision claimed the lives of over a score of men, half the remaining assets of the Armada, a valuable cargo of cloves, and the records maintained by Trinidad's officers, including Magellan himself. When Brito perused the logbooks, he became incensed because they contained damning evidence of the Armada's route through Portuguese waters and its attempts to snatch the Spice Islands away from Portugal. His first victim was Pedro Alfonso de la Rosa, the Portuguese renegade who had joined the fleet when it first called at the Spice Islands. He was beheaded. Brito then considered executing several sailors and pilots, but preferred that they die a slow death in the tropical heat. The Portuguese governor did spare the lives of 2 men, a boatswain and carpenter, but he did so only to press them into service for the Portuguese. He sent the rest of the crew to a fortress under construction on the island of Ternate, with orders to help build it, the timber used to construct the Portuguese fort, and the cannon to protect it, came from the wreck of Trinidad. Now there was only one ship left of the 5 comprising the original Armada de Molucca. This was Victoria, under Elcano's command, and her prospects of returning to Seville appeared even less certain than Trinidad's. Elcano tried repeatedly to set a course around the Cape of Good Hope. The constant pummeling exhausted the crew, and simply finding a quiet moment to consume a few handfuls of barely edible food came to seem a major accomplishment, and getting through the day a miracle of sorts. Of course, the weather continued to batter the boat by night as well, so there was no rest for the crew, nor safe harbor, nor cooking fire, nor soft dry blanket, nor guarantee that their misery would end any time soon. They might double the Cape in a matter of days, but then again they might never be able to accomplish the feat. And if they were forced to turn back, the prospect of starvation in the open stretches of the Indian Ocean or death at the hands of the Portuguese awaited them. And so they tried again and again, fleeing for their lives, hoping to cheat death just one more time. Just when it seemed that the Cape was impassable, the wind shifted slightly and the storms relented briefly. Elcano seized the moment to round Cape Agulhas, the point farthest south on the African continent, with the Cape of Good Hope coming up quickly, almost easy to handle in comparison. Fighting churning waters, sailing as close to the wind as he dared, Elcano finally drove his ship around the Cape of Good Hope. They had survived one more ordeal, and that was enough to give thanks to a merciful Lord. By now it was May 22nd, 1522. The winds had abated, and Victoria was at last able to proceed on a northerly course. Elcano led the weather-beaten ship and her worn-out crew into what is now called Saldanha Bay, just north of Cape Town, where the men rested. There is no record that they thought of themselves as heroic for having outlasted the storm surrounding the Cape of Good Hope. There was no longer any boldness or swagger about them. They had suffered too much for that. The sea had not killed them, but it had humbled them, and they were simply grateful to be alive. Nothing else mattered in comparison with that singular fact. When the men recovered a bit of their strength, there was work to be done. They occupied themselves loading enough water and wood to see them home. For once they were not alone. They shared the bay with a Portuguese ship plying the India route. Elcano imprudently risked making his presence known to the Portuguese captain, who saluted and sailed away. Two ships at the end of the world pursuing their disparate goals. Although Victoria had passed the supreme navigational test, the torments afflicting her crew were not over yet. On June 8, 1522, she crossed the equator yet again. This was the fourth time since the departure from Seville. Pigafetta reported, "Then we sailed northwest for 2 months continually, without taking on any fresh food or water. Inevitably, scurvy returned to devastate the crew. Pigafetta said 21 men died during that short time." He continued, "Finally, constrained by our great extremity, we went to the islands. On Wednesday, July 9th, we reached one of the St. Jacob Islands, by which Pigafetta meant Santiago, the largest of the Cape Verde Islands, off the coast of West Africa, the very same islands that had served as the marker for the line of demarcation under the Treaty of Tordesillas. The islands remained a Portuguese stronghold, a center for commerce in materials and in men. The seas surrounding the Cape Verde Islands were familiar to Portuguese mariners, too familiar, in fact, for Victoria's safety. The farther north she journeyed, the more likely she was to encounter vindictive Portuguese authorities. As soon as Victoria dropped anchor in the port of Ribeira Grande on Santiago Island, Espinosa dispatched a longboat for food needed by the starving crew. Fearing that the Portuguese would likely pounce, the men crafted a story designed to elicit sympathy and avoid uncomfortable facts. They posed as an unlucky, storm-battered Spanish cargo ship, hardly worth troubling over. The ruse seemed to work, and Pigafetta exulted, "With those good words, and with our merchandise, we got 2 boatloads of rice." As an afterthought, Elcano told his men to confirm the date with the Portuguese, just to make sure the ship's log remained accurate after nearly 3 years' record-keeping. The reply, Thursday, baffled the sailors. Pigafetta wrote, "We were greatly surprised, for it was Wednesday with us, and we could not see how we had made a mistake, for I had always kept well, and I had set down every day without interruption. How could they have omitted a day?" As they learned later, Pigafetta said, it was no error, but as the voyage had been made continually toward the west, and we'd returned to the same place as does the sun, we had made a gain of 24 hours. This was no mere bookkeeping oversight. Albo, Pigafetta, and the rest of the survivors erred because the international dateline did not yet exist. No Western cosmologist or astronomer, not even Ptolemy, had anticipated that a correction would be necessary to compensate for sailing around the globe. It took the first circumnavigation to demonstrate the need for a 24-hour gain. As Victoria was about to slip away from Santiago Island, Elcano made a serious mistake. Wrote Albo, "On Monday, the 14th, we sent the ship's boat ashore for more rice. It returned the next day and went back for another load. We waited until night, but it did not return. Then we waited until the next day, but it never returned. Something had gone awry, but no one aboard the ship knew what it was. One possibility was that the 4 Indians who had gone ashore to fetch rice tried to purchase food with cloves. When the Portuguese authorities saw this contraband, which could only have come from the Spice Islands, they became deeply suspicious of Victoria." Albo continued, "We went nearer the port to discover the reason of the delay, whereupon a vessel came out and demanded our surrender, saying that they would send us with the ship that was coming from the Indies, and that they would place their men in our ship, for thus had their officials ordered. Victoria's officers stoutly resisted. Albo wrote, "We requested them to send us our men in the ship's boat. They replied that they would bear our request to their officials. We answered that we would take another tack and wait. Accordingly, we tacked about and set all our sails full and left with 22 men, both sick and well. The number probably included 18 Europeans and 4 captives acquired en route. 22 men, all that remained of the approximately 260 who had left Seville with the Armada 3 years earlier." It was now July 15th, 1522. With barely enough men to handle the ship, Elcano took Victoria along a northerly course to her home port in Spain. Meanwhile, leaks constantly threatened to scuttle Victoria, and the men, in their exhausted condition, were forced to work the pumps night and day simply to stay afloat. Their incessant labor paid off, and by July 28th, Tenerife swung into view, signaling the beginning of a new course toward the Azores to negotiate the northerly winds. Elcano approached the Azores, hoping to take on the fresh provisions they desperately needed and depart before the Portuguese pursued them, but he wisely judged the maneuver too dangerous to attempt. As they worked the pumps, the ship's crew discerned Cape St. Vincent to the north on September 4th. It would be the last important landmark they observed before reaching their goal, and it was a fitting site, for Sagres, the location of Prince Henry the Navigator's academy, was located right on the cape. Cape St. Vincent disappeared in the mists as the Portuguese trades bore Victoria and her skeleton crew east toward the mouth of the Guadalquivir River, its waters churning just as they had 3 years earlier, when the proud Armada de Molucca began the expedition to the Spice Islands. On Saturday, September 6, 1522, wrote Antonio Pigafetta, we entered the bay of Sanlúcar with only 18 men, the majority of them sick, all that were left of the 60 men who had left the Moluccas. Some died of hunger, some deserted at the island of Timor, and some were put to death for crimes. At last, Pigafetta allowed himself a moment of pride concerning the chief accomplishment of the Armada de Molucca. From the time we left that bay, he wrote, until the present day, we sailed 14,460 leagues, nearly 60,000 miles, and furthermore completed the circumnavigation of the world from east to west. To complete her journey around the world, Victoria and her decimated crew had to make one last passage from the harbor of Sanlúcar de Barrameda along the Guadalquivir River into Seville. Elcano sent for a small boat to tow the battered craft and her exhausted crew to the teeming city, now abuzz with talk and excitement concerning the unprecedented voyage. Although her hull was in such poor condition and leaking so copiously that the men had to keep pumping all the way just to stay afloat, Victoria completed her journey along the river to Seville and tied up at a quay on September the 10th. Under the scrutiny of representatives of the king and his financiers, dock workers unloaded the precious cargo that Victoria had traveled around the world to collect, cloves. Even without the other 4 ships, the amount of cloves in Victoria's hold was sufficient to turn a profit for the expedition's backers. The king's agents were pleased to note that the cloves were of first quality, far exceeding those obtained from merchants who had acquired them in the traditional manner, from middlemen using land routes. The cloves filled no less than 381 sacks, weighing 524 quintals. Their value came to 7,888,864 maravedis. By royal order, the cargo passed directly to the expedition's backer, Cristobal de Haro. Within weeks, he was in possession of the precious cloves, which he dispatched to his brother Diego in Antwerp for sale. The profits were divided between the Haros, agents for the Fugger family, and the nearly insolvent Spanish crown. Beyond the profits from spices, the completion of Magellan's voyage finally gave the Spanish a water route to the Spice Islands, if they wanted it. The expedition had ended, but its effects on Spain and on world history were just beginning. As the skeleton crew guided the weather-beaten Victoria to its mooring in Seville, Elcano employed his considerable skills of persuasion in a letter to King Charles to boast of the voyage's multifaceted accomplishments and to justify his assumption of command after Magellan's death. The first account of the first journey around the world, Elcano's letter was dispatched from Sanlúcar de Barrameda even before the ship reached Seville, an indication of Elcano's eagerness to offer explanations. But his letter did little to clear up the mystery of how Magellan died. Nor did Elcano explain how he, a Basque mariner, emerged as the fleet's captain general. And any connection between the two events, Magellan's fall and Elcano's rise, was similarly obscured. The letter concealed more than it revealed. Many serious questions loomed concerning the voyage. Mutinies, the sailors' licentious behavior and outright orgies with women in distant lands, which had been expressly forbidden by the king, and, most important of all, Magellan's conduct at sea and accusations of torture. King Charles never mourned the loss of the captain general, even though Magellan had always regarded the young sovereign as the paragon of all virtues, the recipient of all his loyalties and efforts, the justification of all his suffering. Charles felt no sense of kinship with the ardent Portuguese mariner who had presented himself at Valladolid 4 years earlier, pleading for royal backing for an expedition. The Armada's many scientific and geographic discoveries and the claiming of dozens of islands and lands for Spain made little impression on this preoccupied sovereign, who, through lifelong habit, merely considered such tributes his due. Eventually, King Charles took to boasting about the expedition because it had returned with a shipload of cloves, the aromatic equivalent of gold. King Charles summoned Elcano and 2 men of his choosing to visit the royal residence at Valladolid to provide a full account of their exploits. Elcano selected the pilot, Albo, and the barber medic, Bustamante, to back up his account. Significantly, he excluded Pigafetta, whom he knew to be a Magellan loyalist. As a sign of royal favor, Elcano's delegation received a lavish disbursement for formal clothes and traveling expenses to Valladolid. They could be assured of making an impressive appearance before their sovereign. Charles received the 3 world travelers on October 18th with apparent warmth and congratulated them on having reached the Spice Islands through a water route and claiming them for Spain. Keenly aware of what was expected, Elcano solemnly presented His Majesty with samples of the spices brought back from the Moluccas, as well as letters from the island chieftains swearing loyalty to the unknown ruler of the distant land. All that was very impressive, but just for show. Clouds of suspected disloyalty, even mutiny, hung over the survivors' heads. Just before their arrival in Valladolid, disquieting rumors had reached King Charles. It was whispered that Magellan had not been killed by warriors on Mactan, but by members of the fleet. Could Elcano have been among them? And there were conflicting accounts of the bitter mutiny at Port St. Julian, some blaming the Spanish officers for the uprising, and others holding the Portuguese contingent responsible. To get to the bottom of these stories, the 3 men, Elcano, Albo, and Bustamante, faced an inquiry conducted by Valladolid's mayor, acting on orders from King Charles himself. The proceeding, which began on October 18th, consisted of 13 questions put to the men. The questions concentrated on 2 themes, the mutiny and the commercial aspects of the voyage. Elcano had given considerable thought to the charge of disloyalty that he was bound to face, and during his examination he carefully explained his way out of the mutinies that had occurred on the ships by condemning Magellan. Elcano rearranged events to make it sound as though he had been invited by the Spanish captains to serve as the captain general, that Magellan had favored his relatives on board the ships at the expense of all others, especially the Spanish captains, and that Magellan had defied the king's explicit orders. By portraying himself as a humble defender of Spanish honor, Elcano skillfully played up to King Charles, but he was less successful in his defense of the expedition's commercial aspects. Why, his inquisitors demanded, were there only 524 quintals of cloves on board Victoria when she tied up at the quay in Seville? But the ship's own register clearly showed that she had taken on no less than 600 quintals in the Spice Islands. In his response, Elcano carefully explained that he relied on the weight given by the islanders from whom he had purchased the cloves, that he personally supervised weighing the cargo in Seville, and that any discrepancy could be accounted for by drying during the long voyage home. Next, Elcano was asked why he had failed to keep accounts. Again, the Basque-born mariner tried to shift the blame to Magellan, claiming that as long as Magellan was alive, he had written nothing because he dared not do so, in his own words, while after Magellan's death he did record transactions. This explanation made no sense because Magellan was scrupulous about recording the fleet's activities, whether in Pigafetta's diary or in Albo's pilot's log. Ignoring those inconvenient pieces of evidence, Elcano instead spoke grandly and vaguely about Magellan's disservice to the king and the fleet, which he recklessly abandoned to its fate. His indictment of Magellan was as damning as it was unsupported by the events. Finally, Elcano was forced to confront the disquieting rumors surrounding Magellan's death. In his brief reply, Elcano held the Mactonese islanders completely responsible. By burning their hamlet, Elcano implied, Magellan had goaded them into taking revenge. His explanation went unchallenged and served as the basis of the official determination of the cause of Magellan's death. Elcano's testimony was sufficiently dexterous to exculpate himself from royal disfavor, or worse, and his two companions, giving answers remarkably similar to Elcano's, achieved the same result. By the time the inquiry ended, King Charles and his advisers were reminded that the survivors had brought them a fortune in spices, a claim to the Spice Islands themselves, a new water route to the islands, and an unequaled mastery of the ocean, all of it priceless, no matter how underhanded they had been in getting it. In the end, King Charles waived the royal duties on the spices the men brought home for their personal enrichment and offered a quarter of his own proceeds from the voyage to the 3 survivors who had testified in Valladolid. Elcano's bonus included even more, an annual pension of 500 ducats, a knighthood, and a coat of arms befitting the mariner who had sailed around the world. It depicted a castle, spices, 2 Malay kings, a globe, and the legend, "Thou first circled me." Of equal importance, Elcano received a royal pardon for his role in the failed mutiny against Magellan's command. Elcano insisted on having the document published, making his exoneration complete. He would now be qualified to lead future expeditions for Castile. The other survivors of the expedition received similar marks of royal favor. Martín Méndez, Victoria's accountant, Hernando Bustamante, the barber, Miguel de Rodas, the master of Victoria, and Espinosa each received individualized coats of arms commemorating their accomplishments. Meanwhile, the coat of arms for the Magellan family remained defaced and dishonored, as it had been since Magellan left Portugal to serve the King of Spain, the king who had all but forgotten him now. The men who had mutinied against Magellan, an entire ship filled with them, were freed from prison and absolved of their crimes. Alvaro de Mesquita, who had served as captain of San Antonio until the mutineers overwhelmed him, had languished in jail ever since 1521, when his ship returned to Seville. With Victoria's survivors corroborating his story, the die-hard Magellan loyalist was also freed in a general amnesty designed to end lingering controversy about the voyage. Having had enough of Spanish justice, he fled home to Portugal. By far the most authoritative and eloquent chronicle of the first voyage around the world flowed from the pen of Antonio Pigafetta, who had faithfully maintained his diary throughout the entire expedition. To counter what he expected would be Elcano's self-serving distortions, Pigafetta immediately set about writing his own impassioned plea for Magellan's valor and loyalty to the king and the church. He provided eloquent eyewitness testimony about how Magellan had died, and more important, how he had lived. He revealed Magellan as the fearless disprover of long-standing myths and overturner of tenacious fallacies. Leaving Seville, Pigafetta headed directly for Valladolid. Pigafetta's diplomatic background served him well because he then succeeded in giving his account to other sovereigns who were often bitter enemies of one another. Pigafetta's thorough and even-handed distribution of his account ensured Magellan's leading role in the adventure for posterity, and not so incidentally his own. After traveling across Europe, Pigafetta arrived in Venice, his home, and immediately caused a stir. In August of the following year, Pigafetta, by this time settled in Venice, requested that the Doge and City Council allow him to print his sensational account. He supplied 2 reasons: the overwhelming importance of the events recorded, and Pigafetta's singular authority in relating them. Pigafetta's request met with a favorable response, and he was granted the privilege that no other except himself be allowed to have it printed for 20 years. Although a few influential voices celebrated Magellan's extraordinary accomplishments and appreciated the extent of his ordeal, he was despised or discounted by most authorities and observers from Seville to Lisbon. In both countries, he was considered a traitor, and court historians everywhere prepared to blacken pages with their indictments of his nefarious deeds and treachery. Ironically, Magellan's most fervent admirers were in England, where political commentators urged their island nation to emulate his daring example. Closer to home, King João III of Portugal, the son of the monarch who had spurned Magellan, seethed at the news that one of the ships of the Armada de Molucca had returned to Seville with a full load of cloves. He hotly protested to King Charles, insisting that the Spice Islands actually belonged to Portugal. Charles, for his part, patiently but insistently pressed for the release of the men taken prisoner by the Portuguese in the Cape Verde Islands, and they trickled into Spain in small groups throughout the following year. Victoria's two groups of survivors, for all the hardships they had endured since leaving the Spice Islands, enjoyed far better fortune than the 60 men who had chosen to sail home aboard Trinidad. Only 4 of that number ever returned to Spain or Portugal. A deaf seaman named Juan Rodriguez, at 48 the oldest survivor, stowed away on a Portuguese ship bound for Lisbon. He spent a short time in jail, won his release, made his way back to Seville, and, despite his age, infirmity, and the hardships he had endured during his years at sea, applied to the Casa de Contratación to sail to the Indies once again. Enduring months of hard labor and humiliation in the Moluccas, Espinosa was transported along with several of his crew members to Cochin, a Portuguese outpost on the west coast of India. Refusing a Portuguese invitation to fight the Arabs, he wrote to King Charles complaining that the viceroy, Vasco da Gama, was busy, as he said, menacing me and telling me that my head would be cut off, and dishonoring me with many evil words, saying that he would hang the others. In 1526, after 4 miserable years in captivity, Gonzalo Gomez de Espinosa, the former captain, and Ginés de Mafra, the garrulous pilot, joined the crew's gunner, Hans Varg, aboard a ship bound for Lisbon. Freedom would elude them a little while longer, though. On arrival, the heroic circumnavigators were thrown into jail. Varg died there, leaving all his worldly possessions, his back pay, and a package of cloves to Espinosa. Toughened by years of adversity, de Mafra and Espinosa survived their time in a Lisbon prison as they had survived everything else. Upon their release, they returned to Seville, only to be jailed again. Their case came to trial in 1527. At last they were acquitted and finally released. Both men found their homecoming to be bitter indeed. De Mafra, for one, learned that his wife, assuming that he was dead, had remarried. Not only that, she had spent his entire fortune with her new husband. Disgusted with his lot, de Mafra returned to the life he knew best, that of a pilot in the Pacific. By 1542, he was back in the Philippines in the service of Spain. Espinosa faced a more ambiguous destiny. On August 24, 1527, King Charles granted him an enormous pension, 112,500 maravedis, but Espinosa never received it. The Casa de Contratación, as mean-spirited as ever, withheld the salary he earned during his years in jail, arguing that he was not actually in the service of Spain at the time. Outraged by the treatment he had received at the hands of unfeeling bureaucrats, he sued for twice the amount, settled for half the original pension, and, in the end, received only a fraction of the settlement. And even that modest amount was contingent on his participating in another expedition to the Moluccas. Understandably, Espinosa refused to return to the lands that had claimed the lives of so many Spaniards. In 1529, King Charles decided to bestow another pension on his loyal servant, this time in the amount of 30,000 maravedis, and he received a comfortable job as an inspector and an annual salary of 43,000 maravedis. He lived out his days in Seville. Spain and Portugal agreed to hold another conference to determine the locations of the line of demarcation in the Spice Islands. The Spanish delegates included experts such as Sebastian Elcano, Giovanni Vespucci, Amerigo's sibling, and Sebastian Cabot. Despite the good intentions of the two nations and the credentials of the delegates, the proceedings quickly degenerated into farce. To symbolize the strict impartiality of the deliberations, the summit was held on a bridge spanning the Guadiana River along the Spanish-Portuguese border, but the location nearly undid the conference. As the distinguished members of the Portuguese delegation happened to be walking across the bridge, they were stopped by a small boy, who asked if they were carving up the world with King Charles. The former governor of India, Diogo Lopes de Sequeira, acknowledged that indeed they were. At that, the boy lifted his shirt, turned to reveal his bare bottom, and with his small finger traced the line between his buttocks. "Draw your line right through this place," he declared. The parties adjourned to towns on either side of the river. The cosmologists and astronomers continued to argue over longitude and could not even agree on the length of a degree, so the question of where to place the Moluccas remained unresolved. Magellan had traversed the Pacific, it was true, but no one yet knew how to measure the distance he had traveled, except by dead reckoning, of limited value over long distances. For all these reasons, the attempt to redefine the line of demarcation ended in failure. As might be expected, both sides claimed victory and possession of the Spice Islands. Blithely ignoring the conference, King Charles splurged on lavish follow-up expeditions to the Moluccas, heedless of the cost and the risks involved in these tragic enterprises. In 1525, the Casa de Contratación commissioned a well-connected officer, Francisco Garcia Jofre de Loaiza, to lead the next Armada de Molucca. Elcano, honored as the first circumnavigator, received an appointment as second in command. The voyage's primary goal, to build a fully staffed Spanish trading post and fort in the Spice Islands, demonstrated how hollow King Charles's conciliatory language actually was. Spain remained determined to break the Portuguese monopoly on the spice trade and to claim the islands, no matter what. The Second Armada de Molucca left Seville with the hope that retracing Magellan's route would make the voyage to the Spice Islands far safer and faster, but just the opposite occurred. Without Magellan's navigational genius to guide the ships, the Second Armada met with an even harsher fate than the first. Elcano, despite his experience, made one navigational error after another during the journey, and he arrived at the strait discovered by Magellan only after dangerous delays. Storms in these low latitudes battered the ships of the Armada, reducing their number from 5 to just 2. In the Pacific, scurvy broke out among the officers and the crew, just as it had during Magellan's crossing, and this time no one had quince preserves to protect them from its ravages, not even the Captain General. Loaiza died, leaving behind an envelope prepared by King Charles himself, naming a successor. When the seal was broken, the letter appointed Elcano as the next admiral. The Basque mariner had finally reached the summit of ambition, but the time remaining to him proved to be cruelly brief, because he was already suffering from scurvy. Retreating to his small cabin, he drew up his will. The document carefully inventoried all his worldly possessions, down to the last article of clothing and ream of paper. It listed his many charitable bequests. It specified gifts to his 2 mistresses, and it requested that his funeral take place in his hometown, Guetaria. The will was witnessed by 7 others, each one a Basque. 5 days after assuming command, on August 4th, 1526, Sebastian Elcano died at sea, another casualty of the Age of Discovery. His body was committed to the deep amid the rolling blue expanses of the Pacific. In an eerie recapitulation of Magellan's voyage, just one of the 5 original ships of the Second Armada de Molucca reached the Spice Islands. And of the 450 men who set sail from Spain aboard those ships, only 8 lived to see Spain again, an even greater loss of life than Magellan's crew had suffered. The extraordinary death rate to say nothing of the expense involved, did nothing to deter King Charles from trying to reach the Spice Islands again and again. He sent Sebastian Cabot, then the chief pilot of Seville, in search of the Indies, but the hapless mariner only got as far as the Rio de la Plata, the false strait on the east coast of South America. After a time, Cabot led the third Armada de Molucca back to Spain, where he was charged with failing to complete his mission because he was afraid to enter the real strait and face its dangers. Soon after that debacle, Cortés, the conqueror of Mexico, dispatched his own expedition to the Moluccas from his outpost in Aguatanejo, Mexico. Although this expedition promised to be shorter and did not have to pass through the strait, it too met with disaster. Only one ship reached the Spice Islands, and the Portuguese captured her crew and seized her cargo, abruptly aborting the mission. With each failure, the dream of establishing a Spanish outpost in the Spice Islands and bringing the wealth of the Indies into Spanish coffers faded, and the scope of Magellan's superhuman accomplishment and fierce determination came to seem greater and greater. Desperately short of cash, Charles was unable to send any more expeditions to the Spice Islands. But he did not give up his goal. Instead, he sought a diplomatic solution to thwart or slow Portugal's imperial ambitions. He invited Portugal to join a commission to study the Spice Islands quandary, and he asked the Vatican to arbitrate in case of disagreement. In the end, João III had no choice but to agree to the plan or risk seeming bellicose and heedless of papal authority. In this way, King Charles maintained his interest in the Spice Islands through diplomacy, but not for long. Unable to raise money from his usual backers, Charles was forced to turn to Portugal for aid. In 1529, he borrowed 350,000 ducats from João III, and as security for the loan, he pledged the Moluccas and all the islands lying to the east. Both nations signed the Treaty of Saragossa, ending the epic struggle for control of the global economy. Just 7 years after Magellan's voyage and 3 unsuccessful follow-up expeditions to the Spice Islands, King Charles, facing bankruptcy, gave up and returned the islands to the Portuguese. In matters of empire, everything had its price. Not until 1580, 58 years after Victoria returned to Seville, did another explorer, Sir Francis Drake, complete a circumnavigation. His voyage took him through the Strait of Magellan. To accomplish the feat, Drake relied on the knowledge so painfully and heroically acquired by the Captain General and his crew. Little Victoria, the first ship to complete a circumnavigation, had her own curious epilogue. No one thought to preserve the battered vessel as a testament to Magellan's great achievement. Instead, she was repaired, sold to a merchant for 106,274 maravedis, and returned to service, a workhorse of the Spanish conquest of the Americas. As late as 1570, she was still plying the Atlantic. En route to Seville from the Antilles, she disappeared without a trace. All hands on board were lost. It is assumed that she encountered a mid-Atlantic storm that sent her to the bottom, her wordless epitaph written on the restless waves. In 1531, one of the first accurate maps of the Strait of Magellan appeared. Laurence Bergreen's representation placed the strait in its proper position in South America, and although the map does not name the strait, it does call the Pacific Magellanicum. The name Magellanica, or Magellanic Land, would appear on many later maps of South America, usually indicating Patagonia or Chile. Gerardus Mercator, the Flemish cartographer, canonized the strait in his famous globe in 1536. In time, the name Magellan came to designate only the strait, no lands. At least such was the case on Earth. In the heavens, his name came to be associated with the 2 dwarf galaxies he had discovered, the Magellanic Clouds, visible in the southern hemisphere. Although no continent or country was named after him, Magellan's expedition stands as the greatest sea voyage in the Age of Discovery. In its epic, world-straddling scope, his voyage harkened back to Greek and Roman antiquity, which had been rediscovered and embraced with such conviction during the Renaissance. Peter Martyr, Magellan's contemporary and the first historian of the New World wrote, "Worthier indeed are our sailors of eternal fame than the Argonauts who sailed with Jason. And much more worthy was their ship of being placed along the stars than that old Argo, for they only sailed from Greece through Pontus, but ours through the whole west and southern hemisphere, penetrating into the east, and again returned to the west." By confronting the intellectual and spiritual limitations of the ancient view of the world, by subjecting its assumptions to the ultimate reality check, traveling around the globe, Magellan looked ahead of his time to the age of reason and beyond to the present. In their lust for power, their fascination with sexuality, their religious fervor, and their often tragic ignorance and vulnerability, Magellan and his men epitomized a turning point in history. Their deeds and character, for better or worse, still resonate powerfully.